I sat in Dr. Mason Clark's office, watching him frown at the computer screen. The fluorescent light hummed above us. The kind of sound that makes your skin itch when silence stretches too long. He scrolled through my old medical file. His lips pressed into a thin line. I could tell something was off before he even said a word. When he finally looked up, his voice was steady but quieter than usual. "Jack," he said, "this doesn't make sense. According to this, the medication you've been taking for years wasn't fertility treatment. It was zolpidem, a sleeping aid." For a second I didn't understand. My mind tried to process the words like they were in another language. Zolpidem. Sleeping pills. I laughed. But it came out strangled. Like something sharp was caught in my throat. "That's not possible," I told him. "You prescribed hormone therapy, testosterone boosters." "I followed everything exactly like you said." Dr. Clark shook his head slowly. "That's what the record should show. But these refills weren't mine. And the name on the pickup signature?" He paused, eyes flicking up to me with something that looked almost like pity. "It says, Rebecca Moore." The sound of that name hit me like a hammer. My wife. My ex-wife. She'd signed for the medication. My hands went cold. I stared at the page. At the digital signature glowing on the screen. My name typed neatly below hers. My stomach twisted until I could barely breathe. I asked him if this was some kind of mistake. Maybe the pharmacy mislabeled it. He exhaled. Slow and tired. "Jack, I wish that were true. I checked the prescription codes myself. Whoever changed it did it intentionally. I'm sorry. Man." When I left the clinic, the late afternoon sun was blinding. Cars honked somewhere down the street. People laughed on the sidewalk. Life went on, but I couldn't move. My legs felt like concrete. 7 years. 7 years of swallowing those damn pills every morning. Believing I was fixing myself, I had begged God for a miracle. For the chance to give my wife a child. And all along I'd been sedating myself. I sat in my truck, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. I tried to replay the years in my head, to find the moment where everything shifted. The memory came easily. It was 2016. Rebecca and I had been married for 2 years. Back then, she was all charm and energy, the kind of woman who could walk into a room and make everyone look twice. She'd started working at a real estate firm downtown, Bright Nest Realty, and within months, she was one of their top agents. She loved the attention. I loved her confidence. When the doctor first told me I had a mild hormonal imbalance, I thought it was nothing. A few months of medication, a couple lifestyle changes, and we'd be fine. I remember walking out of that clinic feeling optimistic. Rebecca held my hand and said, "Don't worry, baby. We'll get through this together." But somewhere along the way, her tone changed. She started timing my medication, reminding me to take it. Almost obsessively, she'd check the bottles, count the pills, call the pharmacy herself. I thought she was just being caring. Looking back now, I feel stupid. At night she'd scroll through Instagram, looking at pictures of couples with babies, smiling but never smiling at me. One night she said, "Maybe it's just not meant to be. Maybe you and I weren't built for that kind of life." I told her not to give up so easily. She rolled her eyes. "You're always so positive." "Jack, it's exhausting." I didn't realize it then. But that was the beginning of the end. When Dr. Clark told me about the zolpidem, my brain replayed every moment that used to feel normal. Her sudden patience when I said I was tired. The way she always offered to bring me water with my pills. Her little laugh when I'd fall asleep on the couch mid-conversation. Jesus. She'd been feeding me sleeping pills and pretending to care when I passed out. I started the engine, but I didn't drive. I just sat there, staring through the windshield at nothing. I could still hear her voice. That soft Georgia accent that once made everything sound gentle. "Jack, trust me. I'll take care of it." 7 years. All that humiliation, the whispers from friends, the pity in my mother's eyes, my father's silence. The day Rebecca told her friends I was cursed, that my bloodline was broken, that I couldn't give her a child. I'd laughed it off in public, but at home I punched the bathroom wall until my hand bled. And through it all, I kept taking those pills, trusting her. I pulled out of the parking lot and drove aimlessly through Austin. The streets were crowded, full of life. The city looked the same, but everything inside me had shifted. Every stoplight felt like a question I couldn't answer. How could someone you love that much destroy you so completely? And make it look effortless? By the time I reached the old bridge over the Colorado River, the sun was low. The water reflected orange and red, almost peaceful. I parked and sat on the hood, feeling the wind on my face. My phone buzzed in my pocket. It was an old contact from work, a group chat that hadn't been active in years. Someone had sent a photo from Rebecca's new ad campaign. She was standing in front of a luxury home, all smiles, holding a baby on her hip. The caption read, "Family is everything." My throat tightened. The irony burned. I stared at the screen until my eyes stung, then tossed the phone onto the seat. I thought of Dr. Clark's voice again. This wasn't a mistake. Jack. Someone changed it intentionally. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in my apartment, surrounded by years of files. Old receipts. Medical reports. I spread them across the floor, scanning for patterns, for anything that could explain why. Maybe she hated me. Maybe she just wanted out. Or maybe, worst of all, she'd never loved me to begin with. The clock read 2:17 a.m. when I found the first real clue. A pharmacy invoice dated March 2016. The pickup signature was sloppy, but the last name was clear as daylight. Rebecca Moore. I stared at it until the paper blurred. There was a numb, cold clarity in my chest. The kind that comes when grief finally burns itself out and turns into something sharper. I folded the receipt carefully and placed it on the table beside me. I wasn't sure what I was going to do yet. All I knew was that the story I'd been living in for 7 years wasn't real. The woman I thought I knew had rewritten it. And now, for the first time, I needed to know how deep the lies went. I leaned back in the chair, listening to the faint hum of the city outside, the occasional passing car, the sound of someone else's life moving on. My hands were still trembling, but my mind had never been clearer. The truth wasn't just ugly, it was deliberate, and I was done pretending I didn't see it. The next morning I called in sick and stayed home, surrounded by the same stack of papers from the night before. The sunlight cut through the blinds, sharp and cold. My head felt heavy, like I'd been awake for days. But sleep wasn't an option. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her handwriting on that receipt. Rebecca Moore, my wife, signing for the medication that was supposed to fix me. I made coffee, though it tasted like metal, and sat on the couch staring at the framed photo still hanging by the hallway. It was from our 3rd anniversary. She was laughing, her hand on my chest, her eyes bright like she actually loved me. Back then, I used to look at that picture and think I was the luckiest man alive. Now all I saw was performance. I remembered the day we first met. It was at a friend's barbecue out in Round Rock. I'd just started at Nexus Tech, still the quiet guy in the corner who didn't know anyone. Rebecca showed up wearing this bright red dress that somehow looked casual on her. She was the kind of woman who drew attention without trying. She walked straight up to me with a plastic cup of beer and said I looked like I needed company. We spent the whole afternoon talking about everything and nothing. She laughed at my dumb jokes, said I was different from the guys she usually met. I didn't know that different would later mean easier to control. Things moved fast after that. Within a year, we were living together. She made every space feel like a magazine cover, clean and perfect. I thought it was care. Now I realize it was control. She organized my clothes, my meals, even my schedule. If I forgot to take the pills, she'd remind me. Her tone half teasing, half annoyed. "Jack, you can't mess up the treatment." I'd laugh. "Tell her not to worry." God, I was such an idiot. Back in those days, my life revolved around her approval. She had this way of making me feel like I was almost good enough, but never quite there. She'd say things like, "You're such a solid guy, Jack, but sometimes you lack ambition," or "I wish you'd be more assertive, like my boss." She compared me to everyone she admired and smiled as if it was a compliment. It chipped away at me piece by piece until I started believing I needed fixing. We went to fertility specialists, took endless tests, paid thousands in bills. When the doctor explained my hormone levels were low, I remember how quiet she got. She didn't hold my hand, didn't say a word. On the drive home, she just stared out the window. Finally, she said, "You'll do whatever it takes to fix this." Right, I said yes. Of course I would. She smiled then. Small and cold. Good. I started treatment in early 2016. She managed everything. She said she wanted to help. To make it easier for me, she picked up my prescriptions, made charts for doses, checked in on the pharmacy like a project manager running a campaign. She even joked that we'd make a baby planner app if it all worked out. At the time, I thought it was funny. The first few months I felt tired all the time. I'd pass out early, sometimes right after dinner. She said the medication made me drowsy, that it was normal. I believed her. When I started forgetting things, like whether I'd taken the pills or not, she said it was stress. When I began waking up disoriented, she told me I worked too hard. One night in July, we were watching a movie. I remember because it was storming outside, thunder rolling like it wanted to break the world open. She leaned against me, her head on my shoulder, and said softly, "What if this doesn't work? What if you can't give me a child?" I said, "Then we'd adopt." That it didn't matter. She didn't respond. I felt her body stiffen. And after a while, she got up and went to bed without a word. The next morning, she was gone before I woke up. I found a note on the kitchen counter. "Gone to pick up your meds. Don't forget breakfast. Love you." That was the first time she signed for the prescription herself. I didn't know it, but that was also the day she stopped being my partner. For the next 2 years, we drifted. We still went to dinners, still smiled in photos, still looked like the perfect couple. But at home, there was silence. She'd stay out late, saying she had clients to meet. I'd wait up. The house dark except for the glow of her phone lighting up the counter. One night I saw a text preview from someone named Rob that said, "Had a great time. Same spot next week." She deleted it before I could read more. I confronted her once, and she turned it into an attack. "You're paranoid, Jack. Maybe the problem isn't my phone. Maybe it's your ego." After that, I stopped asking. I poured myself into work. The projects at Nexus Tech were a distraction, something I could actually fix. I stayed late most nights. My coworkers called me dedicated. I called it survival. By 2018, she said she wanted to move to a bigger house. I didn't see the point, but she insisted, said it was time for a fresh start. We bought a house on the north side of Austin. All glass and white walls. She decorated everything in neutral colors. Sometimes I'd come home and not recognize the place. It looked perfect, but it didn't feel like home. Then, one morning, she told me she was pregnant. I still remember the way she said it. Standing by the window, light hitting her face just right. Her voice was calm, almost rehearsed. "I'm pregnant." I froze. Part of me was happy, of course, but another part, deep down, felt a flicker of doubt. The doctor had said my condition needed more time, more testing, but I pushed that thought away. I wanted to believe her. The months that followed were the strangest of my life. She became softer, more affectionate, almost like the woman I married. She held my hand at appointments, sent me photos of baby clothes, talked about names. Everyone around us celebrated, and I felt lucky again. But something never sat right. She refused to let me talk to her doctor, said she wanted to keep it private. When I asked about prenatal visits, she'd brush it off, saying everything was perfect. Then the baby was born, and the moment I saw him, I knew. The hair, the skin tone, the shape of his eyes, none of it matched. The nurse said, "Congratulations." Rebecca smiled like an actress hitting her cue. I couldn't speak. My chest felt hollow. Later, when I asked quietly if we could get a paternity test, she laughed. But her eyes were ice. "You think I'd cheat on you? Jack, you think any woman would want to sleep with you after what you've put me through?" I said nothing. There was no point. That night I slept in the guest room. She didn't come looking for me. Now, sitting in my apartment 7 years later, I replayed every second of that night. The way she looked at me, not like a partner, but like an obstacle. I had spent years blaming myself for not being enough, for not being the man she needed. But the truth was worse than anything I'd imagined. She had made sure I couldn't be. Outside, the city was waking up. I heard the garbage truck rumbling down the street, the distant hum of life that didn't care about mine. I looked around my apartment. The empty bottles on the counter, the half-eaten takeout, the silence. I thought about calling my mother but couldn't bring myself to. What would I even say? Hey mom, remember how Rebecca said I was infertile? Turns out she made me that way. Instead, I opened my laptop and started a new folder. I named it simply Truth. Inside it, I saved a scan of the pharmacy receipt. Then I opened my email and typed the name of someone I hadn't spoken to in years. Evelyn Shaw. I didn't know what I'd say yet, but I knew I needed help. This wasn't just betrayal anymore. This was a crime. I sat back, staring at the screen, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. For the first time in years, I felt something close to purpose. The woman who had rewritten my life had left a trail, and I was going to follow it. The cursor blinked on the empty email screen while my hands hovered over the keyboard. I didn't even know how to start. Hi, Evelyn. Long time no see. My wife may have been poisoning me for 7 years. That sounded insane, but that was the truth. I deleted the draft and closed the laptop. My heart was pounding, my thoughts running in loops. I needed air. I threw on a jacket and stepped outside into the sticky Austin heat. It was late morning. Traffic was loud, and everything felt too normal for the kind of day when your world collapses. I walked for blocks without thinking, past the cafe, where Rebecca used to order those overpriced green juices, past the park where we once took pictures pretending to be happy. Every step made the memories heavier. Eventually, I stopped at a small diner near the highway. The kind of place with vinyl seats and stale coffee. The waitress looked tired but kind. I ordered eggs and bacon. Though I barely tasted them, I kept thinking about that night in the hospital. The nurse handing me the baby, Rebecca smiling like she'd pulled off the perfect performance. The disbelief had been too big to fit into words. Back then, I'd told myself to move on, to be supportive. That's what good men did. But good men got destroyed in silence. My phone buzzed. It was a message from Mark Ellis, my old manager at Nexus Tech. It just said, "Hey, man, saw the post. Call me if you need anything." I froze. Post. What post? I opened Facebook. Rebecca's face filled the screen. Radiant and perfect. She'd posted a picture of herself holding the baby. Captioned, "Miracles happen when you have faith, even if some people are too cursed to understand it." Hundreds of likes, hearts, comments full of sympathy. The word cursed punched me right in the chest. I could almost hear her voice, calm and venomous, saying it to her friends over wine. I knew what she was doing, making me the problem, painting herself as the saint who survived my flaws. I scrolled through the comments. A few of my coworkers had liked it. One even wrote, "So happy for you both, God bless your family." I wanted to smash the phone, but instead I put it face down and just sat there, shaking. The waitress came back and asked if I wanted more coffee. I nodded, not trusting my voice. When I got home, the messages kept coming. Some from friends trying to be polite, some from people who just wanted gossip. My inbox filled with pity disguised as concern. That night I went to bed feeling like the whole world had been let in on a secret I didn't even know I was part of. The next week at work was brutal. I could feel the whispers before I even reached my desk. Mark pulled me into his office and closed the door. He didn't look angry, just uncomfortable. "Jack, I don't know how to say this, but the board's been talking. They think it might be best if you take some time off. You know, let things cool down." Cool down. Like my reputation was just some overheated rumor, not a public execution. I nodded because arguing wouldn't fix anything. He tried to sound supportive. "I'll make sure your position's still here when you're ready." But I could tell from his eyes it was already gone. When I left the building, I passed 2 coworkers by the vending machine. One whispered something. The other laughed. I didn't hear the words, but I didn't have to. I knew exactly what they were saying. That night I sat alone in the apartment, the only sound coming from the hum of the fridge. I opened a bottle of whiskey I'd been saving since our wedding day and poured a glass. The burn felt good. For the first time, I understood how men lose themselves quietly. One drink at a time. Days blurred together. The humiliation stuck like oil. No matter how many showers I took, every time I thought I'd hit the bottom, something else dragged me lower. My mother called once. Her voice gentle but cautious. "Honey, are you okay? You can always come home for a bit." I said I was fine. I wasn't. But how do you explain to your mother that your wife made you a joke? One evening, while scrolling through emails, I saw a notification from Rebecca's lawyer. A divorce petition. I opened it and read every line. Her reason, emotional neglect, and inability to provide a family. The audacity almost made me laugh. She had the nerve to put that in writing. I spent the next few days cleaning, packing, trying to act like this was just another breakup. But it wasn't. It was the death of who I thought I was. I didn't even have anger left. Just this hollow ache. I boxed up our wedding photos and the framed sonogram she'd faked. I didn't know what to do with them. So I put them in the trash chute and listened to them crash somewhere below. When the court date came, I stood across from her for the first time in months. She looked immaculate. Like she'd dressed for a photo shoot instead of a divorce hearing. Her lawyer spoke for her while mine tried to argue financials. At one point she looked right at me and smiled. Not the warm smile I used to know. This one was cold. Victorious. The judge asked if I had anything to say. I shook my head. What was there to say that the woman I married had fed me sleeping pills instead of medicine? That she'd stolen my dignity in front of everyone. No one would believe me without proof. And I didn't have it yet. Afterward, I walked out of the courthouse into a storm. The rain hit hard, soaking my suit in seconds. I stood there for a long time, watching people rush to their cars, holding their umbrellas tight. The thunder rolled overhead, and I realized I didn't have anywhere to go. I moved into a small one-bedroom in Houston not long after. I sold most of the furniture. Rebecca kept the house. Of course. She'd earned it. At least on paper. I got the old truck and my computer. And that was enough. At first, I told myself I'd start over, but the world doesn't forget. People remember headlines, whispers, and stories told at dinner tables, even miles away. I could feel the weight of her lie following me. One night I ran into an old friend at a bar. He hesitated before saying hello. After a drink or two, he finally asked the question everyone wanted to. "So, is it true, you know? About the curse thing?" I laughed. Not the kind of laugh that means something's funny, but the kind that comes from disbelief. I wanted to tell him everything, but instead I just said, "Yeah, I guess so." Then I finished my drink and left. That was the night something inside me shifted. The shame started turning into something else. Something sharper. I realized Rebecca hadn't just ruined a marriage. She'd rewritten who I was, and I couldn't let that stand. Back at home, I took out the folder I'd made. The one labeled Truth. Inside it was the pharmacy receipt. The first real crack in her story. I looked at it under the desk lamp. The ink faint but legible. March 2016. Pickup signature, Rebecca Moore. It wasn't much, but it was enough to remind me I wasn't crazy. There was proof. Somewhere out there. More of it existed. I didn't sleep that night either. I sat by the window, watching the lights of the city flicker in the distance, listening to the sound of rain hitting the glass. The anger didn't scare me anymore. It felt steady, focused. For the first time in years, I wasn't the man she said I was. I was the man who was going to make her answer for what she did. I didn't know where to start, but I knew I couldn't do it alone. The folder on my desk was getting thicker every day, filled with copies of receipts, insurance records, anything that had Rebecca's name on it. Proof that she'd been in control of my medication from day one. I stared at the papers until the words blurred together. Then I picked up my phone and called Evelyn Shaw. We hadn't talked in years. She used to be one of my closest friends in college. The kind of person who didn't waste time on small talk. When she answered, her voice was the same as I remembered. Calm. Sharp. A little cautious. "Jack Moore." Wow. That's a blast from the past. What's going on? I hesitated. My throat dry. "I have a situation. It's about Rebecca. I need some legal advice." There was a pause. Then the sound of her sigh through the line. I heard about the divorce. Jack. I'm sorry. It's not about the divorce. I said quietly. It's about something she did to me years ago. Something criminal. Evelyn didn't speak right away. When she finally did, her tone changed. Meet me tomorrow, she said. My office. 10 a.m. Her office was in downtown Houston. All glass and steel. The kind of place that smelled like success and expensive coffee. When I walked in, she was sitting behind a desk covered in case files. Her hair pulled back. Glasses perched on her nose. She looked up, studying me for a moment. You look like hell, she said. Thanks, I said. Feels about right. I told her everything. From the fertility treatment, to the fake pregnancy, to finding the pharmacy record. I laid the papers out on her desk like evidence in a trial. She didn't interrupt, just listened. Her expression unreadable. When I finished, she sat back in her chair. Jack, this is serious. If she forged your prescription, that's not just fraud. That's medical tampering. It's a felony. I felt something stir in my chest. Relief, maybe. Or vindication. So I'm not crazy. No, she said. But it's going to be hard to prove. You'd need confirmation from the pharmacy. From the doctor. Maybe a witness. And Rebecca, she's well connected. I nodded. Bright Nest Realty had made her a local celebrity. She was the golden girl of Austin real estate. Smiling face on billboards. Charity galas. Talk shows. People loved her. I was the ghost of her past. Evelyn leaned forward. I need to be honest. Jack. I used to represent Bright Nest's parent company. Conflict of interest could bite me later. I stared at her. So you can't help me. She paused. Then said, I didn't say that. I said it'll be tricky. Let me make a few calls. The next few days crawled by. I couldn't focus on work. My contract clients started pulling back. And I could tell the gossip had followed me here too. A coworker accidentally forwarded an email thread one afternoon where someone wrote, Poor guy. Still pretending he's normal. It stung. But I kept my mouth shut. I wasn't going to defend myself anymore. On Friday, Evelyn called, Meet me at the coffee shop on Main. She said, I found someone who might talk. When I got there, she was already sitting with a woman I didn't recognize. Late 20s maybe. Nervous. Clutching a paper cup like it might float away. Evelyn introduced her as Dr. Linda Paris. She used to work at the clinic where you were treated. Linda looked down. Voice trembling. I shouldn't be doing this. But I can't live with it anymore. I was an intern back then. One day. Your wife came in alone. She said you were sick and asked to pick up your prescription. I remember because she brought cookies for the staff. She laughed. Said you'd forget them otherwise. I asked quietly. Did you give it to her? She nodded. I didn't know what she planned to do. Later. The senior doctor told me to log the refill under your name. I thought it was odd. But I was new. And, she trailed off. Then last week, I saw your name in a news article about her new charity project. It made me sick. Evelyn handed me a flash drive. She saved copies of some old digital logs before the files were deleted. It's not a full record. But it's something. I stared at it. The small silver thing that suddenly felt like the heaviest object in the world. That night, I drove back to Austin. The city looked different now. Smaller somehow. Suffocating. I parked near the downtown offices of Bright Nest Realty. Her name was everywhere. Rebecca Moore. Luxury home specialist. The windows glowed with warm light. Inside, I could see her laughing with a couple. Perfectly poised. Selling a dream. I stood across the street for a long time. Just watching. I remembered how proud I used to be of her. How I used to brag about her success. Now all I could see was performance. Manipulation. The mask she'd perfected. A notification buzzed on my phone. A link from Evelyn. It was a public record search she'd pulled for me. Buried in it was an address I didn't recognize. Rebecca Moore. Listed as co-owner of a company called ClearPath Wellness LLC. I clicked through the site. It was a women's health consulting business. Photos of smiling mothers. Babies. Promises of empowerment. She was running a fertility consulting company. I laughed out loud in the dark. The sound bitter and raw. The woman who stole my ability to have children was making money off other people's desperation. I wanted to storm inside. Confront her. Yell. Anything. But I didn't. I turned off my phone and walked back to the truck. The next morning, I went to see my mother. She lived in a small town outside Waco. Quiet and simple. Nothing like the world Rebecca belonged to. Mom opened the door, her face softening the moment she saw me. "You look tired," she said. I hugged her. And for the first time in years, I didn't try to act fine. Over coffee? I told her everything. She didn't interrupt. Didn't try to offer excuses. When I finished, she just reached across the table and squeezed my hand. Some people destroy others just to feel powerful. Jack. But truth has a way of crawling back to the light. I wanted to believe that. But truth didn't pay bills or fix reputations. When I drove home that evening, I found a letter taped to my door. It was from my landlord. Final notice. Rent due. I'd been so caught up in the past that I hadn't realized I was slipping in the present. I sat on the couch, surrounded by unpaid bills. Court letters. And that single flash drive. My life was in pieces. But I wasn't broken. Not anymore. I opened my laptop and plugged the drive in. The screen flickered to life. And a list of medical records appeared. Timestamps. Initials. And prescription codes. My breath caught when I saw the confirmation line. Picked up by R. Moore. Verified by L. Perez. It wasn't everything I needed. But it was proof that Rebecca had started this chain. I closed the laptop and leaned back in the chair. For years, she'd made me believe I was cursed. But she'd made one mistake. She underestimated how much a man could take before he stopped being afraid. Somewhere deep inside, I felt the anger shift again. It wasn't rage anymore. It was precision. The kind that cuts slow and clean. I knew what had to come next. I needed to face her. Not as the broken husband she left behind, but as the man who finally knew the truth. Outside, thunder rolled over the city. I didn't move. I just watched the storm through the window, waiting for it to break. The storm outside had been raging for hours. Rain beating against the windows like it wanted in. I sat in the dark, the laptop screen glowing in front of me, replaying the same lines over and over. Picked up by R. Moore. Verified by L. Perez. Every time I saw her name, my pulse spiked. It wasn't just anger anymore. It was proof. I closed the laptop and rubbed my temples, trying to think straight. I couldn't just walk into the police station with a flash drive and a story. She had influence. Money. Connections. If I came at her the wrong way, she'd bury me again. I needed more. Something undeniable. The next morning, I called Evelyn. She picked up on the second ring. Her voice low. "Careful. Did you open the files?" "Yeah." I said, "They're real." She paused for a moment. Then her tone shifted. "Jack, listen to me. We need to move carefully. If what you're saying is true, Rebecca committed medical fraud and assault. But if we don't have full documentation, she could twist it around." I leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling. "So what do you need?" "We need the doctor who signed off on your prescriptions," she said. "The one who authorized the records. If we can get him to talk, we can build a case." I knew the name from the files. Dr. Howard Graham. I remembered him vaguely. Tall. Quiet. Never making eye contact. I dug through old papers until I found a clinic card with his number. When I called, the receptionist said he wasn't available. Retired 2 years ago. She told me. Moved to Galveston. No forwarding contact. That night, I drove to Galveston anyway. I didn't know what I was looking for. But sitting around, waiting for answers, wasn't an option. The drive was long and quiet. The highway wet from rain. By the time I reached the coast, it was close to midnight. The small beach town was asleep. Lights glowing in empty windows. I checked into a cheap motel, the kind with peeling paint and humming AC units, and lay on the bed staring at the ceiling fan. Somewhere between exhaustion and anger, I drifted off. The next morning, I started asking questions. The first pharmacy clerk I spoke to said he remembered a Dr. Graham renting a small office near the pier. When I found the building, the door was locked and dusty. A faded for lease sign taped to the glass. But someone had scribbled a phone number on the side of the door frame. I called it. The voice that answered was older. Raspy. Cautious. "This is Howard. Dr. Graham, this is Jack Moore. You treated me a few years ago." Silence. Then a long exhale. "I was wondering when you'd find me." He agreed to meet at a diner nearby. When I arrived, he was already there, sitting in a booth by the window. A cup of coffee untouched in front of him. His hands shook slightly as he lifted it. "You look tired," he said. "You know why I'm here?" He nodded slowly. "I know. I wish I could say I was surprised." "Then tell me what you did," I said quietly. "Tell me what she made you do." He stared into his coffee. Eyes hollow. "Rebecca came to me before your treatment started. She said she was worried about your side effects and wanted to manage the doses herself. She offered funding to the clinic for research support. I didn't ask questions. I should have." "Did she switch my medication?" He swallowed hard. "She gave me a list of what she claimed you were allergic to. I substituted safer alternatives. Or so I thought. A month later, she brought in her own supply. Said she'd gotten them directly from the manufacturer. I didn't know what was in them. When I realized, it was too late. I clenched my fists under the table. You knew she was giving me something else and you let it happen." He shook his head. "I didn't know until much later. When I confronted her, she said if I talked, she'd ruin me. And she could. She had investors, lawyers, people who owed her favors." She smiled when she said it, like it was all a game. I pulled out my phone. "Recording. I need you to say that again. Dr. Graham. Please." He hesitated, then nodded. He repeated every word, voice trembling, but clear enough. When he finished, he leaned forward, eyes wet. "She's dangerous. Jack. You think you know her, but you don't." I left the diner with the recording saved and backed up twice. For the first time, I had real evidence. That night, Evelyn called again. I told her everything. She was silent for a long moment, then said, "That's enough to move forward. We can file a formal complaint. Maybe even push for an investigation. But Jack, once this starts, it won't stop. She's going to fight back. I'm counting on it." When I got back to Houston, I didn't go home right away. I drove to the Bright Nest office again, parked across the street, and watched. Rebecca came out just after 7, dressed in a sleek black suit, her smile as polished as ever. She walked beside a man I didn't recognize. Tall, confident, his hand brushing hers. She laughed, tilting her head the way she used to with me. My stomach twisted. I followed them to a restaurant downtown. I sat 2 tables behind, pretending to scroll through my phone. I watched her laugh, touch his arm, play the role she'd always played so well. The man handed her an envelope. She slipped it into her purse without looking inside. Something in me snapped. I got up, walked out before I did something I couldn't take back. The rain had started again by the time I reached my truck. I sat there gripping the steering wheel, my breath coming fast. I wasn't the kind of man who believed in fate or karma. But that night I prayed for both. Back home, I listened to the recording again. Her manipulation, the doctor's guilt. Every word felt heavier than the last. I sent the file to Evelyn, who promised to secure it. Then I poured a drink and stared at the city lights. For years, Rebecca had taken everything from me. My health, my name, my peace. But she didn't realize that when she broke me, she also built something harder in its place. The next step wasn't about anger anymore. It was about justice. Real, documented, undeniable justice. I turned off the lights, letting the room fall into darkness. The storm had stopped outside, leaving only the faint dripping of water from the gutters. The quiet was heavy, but it didn't scare me anymore. I closed my eyes and made myself a promise. Tomorrow, she would finally see the man she created. The morning light cut through the blinds, slicing across the room and landing on the stack of documents scattered across my coffee table. My head ached from lack of sleep. but my mind was sharp. Almost too sharp. The plan was forming. Piece by piece. Like a puzzle I'd been too blind to solve before. Evelyn called early. Her voice tense. She'd already contacted the district attorney's office. They wanted an official statement. Copies of everything. And most importantly, the recording. By noon, I was sitting in her office again. The walls were lined with shelves of case files. But the air felt different now. Heavier. Evelyn placed her coffee aside and looked at me with that lawyer stare that said she was already thinking 10 steps ahead. "Jack," she said, "the DA is interested. But we need to be realistic. This isn't going to be quick. Your ex-wife has influence. Lawyers. And public sympathy. She'll come after you the second she finds out." I nodded. "I've already lost everything she could take." Evelyn leaned back, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Then maybe that makes you dangerous enough to win." We filed the formal complaint that afternoon. Fraud, medical tampering, and criminal negligence. She warned me that once it became public record, the storm would start. She wasn't wrong. 2 days later, the first call came. "Rebecca." I let it ring out. But she left a voicemail. Her voice was calm, almost sweet. "Jack, I heard you're talking to lawyers. That's not smart. You don't know what you're getting yourself into. Let it go. You're only hurting yourself." Hearing her voice again made my skin crawl. She still sounded like she owned me, like nothing had changed. That night, I went to a bar downtown. The kind of place where no one asks questions. I sat at the counter nursing a beer, thinking about everything I'd lost. I could feel eyes on me. When I turned, a man in a suit was watching from the far end of the bar. He smiled, lifted his glass slightly, then turned back to his phone. When I left, I saw him again across the street, leaning against a car. My gut tightened. I knew a tale when I saw one. Rebecca was having me watched. I didn't go home that night. I drove aimlessly for hours. The city fading into quiet highways and dark fields. By the time I stopped at a rest area, the sun was coming up. I sat in the truck watching the horizon shift from black to gold. And for the first time in years, I felt calm. She was afraid. That meant I was close. Later that morning, Evelyn called again. Her voice was clipped, hurried. "Jack, the DA has scheduled a preliminary review next week. But be careful. Rebecca's team filed a motion claiming you've been harassing her. They're trying to flip the narrative." I laughed bitterly. That's her specialty. Evelyn didn't laugh. "She's also hired private security. They might try to intimidate you. Don't engage. Jack, let me handle it legally." But I couldn't sit still anymore. I went through the flash drive again. Every file. Every timestamp. Every signature. Something caught my eye this time. One of the entries listed a payment from a company I didn't recognize. Westlake Partners, LLC. I looked it up. It was one of Bright Nest's shell companies. One Rebecca used for property acquisitions. And one of their board members was Dr. Graham's name. Buried in the records. It all connected. She hadn't just bribed him with cash. She'd made him a partner. Given him a stake in her company to keep him silent. That evening, I drove back to Galveston. The sky was gray. The air thick with the smell of salt and rain. Dr. Graham's small rental house sat on a quiet street near the water. His car was in the driveway. When he opened the door, his eyes widened like he'd seen a ghost. "You shouldn't be here," he said quickly, glancing past me like someone might be watching. I stepped inside before he could stop me. "Why didn't you tell me you were part of her company?" He froze. His mouth opened but no sound came out. I held up the printed document. "Westlake Partners, LLC. Your name is right here. Dr. Graham. You didn't just help her. You profited from it." He sat down heavily, his face pale. "I didn't know it was connected to her," he whispered. "She told me it was a medical research grant. Then when I tried to back out, she threatened my license." I took a deep breath, forcing down the anger. "I need you to testify." He shook his head immediately. "I can't. She'll destroy me." "She already did," I said quietly. "You just haven't felt it yet." For a moment, he didn't move. Then his shoulders sagged. "I'll think about it." That wasn't enough. But it was something. When I got back to Houston, I found an envelope slipped under my door. No return address. Inside was a single photo. It was me sitting at the bar from 2 nights ago. A drink in my hand. The flash from a camera catching me mid-blink. On the back, in neat handwriting, were the words, "Stop digging." I laughed. Because of course she'd play it like that. Psychological warfare. Classic Rebecca. I put the photo on the fridge with a magnet. Right next to the rent notice. A reminder of what I was up against. The next few days were quiet. Too quiet. Evelyn was preparing documents. I was collecting every scrap of evidence I could. Late one night, as I was sorting files, I got a message from an unknown number. It was a video. I hit play. The footage was grainy. Like security cam footage. It showed me walking into Dr. Graham's house, then leaving half an hour later. The text that followed read, "Trespassing. That's a crime. Jack." I sent the video to Evelyn. She called almost immediately. "Jack. They're baiting you. They're building a counter case. Don't talk to anyone without me." I nodded even though she couldn't see it. The tension built every day leading up to the review. I barely slept. Barely ate. My hands trembled when I tried to sign paperwork. But I couldn't back down. Not now. The night before the hearing, I got another call from an unknown number. I almost didn't answer. But something told me to. It was Rebecca. Her voice was smooth. Controlled. "You're making a mistake. Jack. Whatever you think you know. You don't. You're sick. Remember, always have been." I could hear the smile in her voice. "You drugged me," I said quietly. "You stole 7 years of my life." She sighed. As if I were a child she had to correct. "You were weak. Jack. I just gave you peace. Be grateful I didn't give you worse." Then the line went dead. I stood there for a long time. Phone still in my hand. My reflection staring back from the dark window. Her words echoed in my head. Each one sharper than the last. Peace. That's what she called it. I didn't sleep that night either. I sat in the kitchen. The flash drive beside my coffee mug. The rain tapping softly against the glass. By morning, the sky was clear. I dressed in my only clean suit and drove downtown. As I walked into the courthouse, reporters were already outside. Cameras flashing. Questions shouted over one another. I didn't stop to answer. Inside, Evelyn met me with a firm nod. "You ready?" I looked past her at the doors ahead. My pulse steady for the first time in months. "Yeah," I said quietly. "I'm ready." The courtroom was colder than I expected. The kind of cold that seeps through your jacket and settles in your bones. I sat beside Evelyn at the plaintiff's table. Papers spread out neatly in front of us, though my hands couldn't stop shaking. Across the room, Rebecca sat with her lawyer. Calm. Polished. Like she was posing for a magazine shoot. Her hair was tied back. Her makeup flawless. Her confidence almost obscene. She didn't even look at me. Not once. The clerk read out the case summary. My name sounded strange in that sterile room. Like it belonged to someone else. Jack Moore. Claimant. Rebecca Moore. Defendant. The judge. A tall man with gray hair and a tired face. Asked if both sides were ready. Evelyn stood. Ready. Your Honor. Rebecca's lawyer. A slick guy in an expensive navy suit. Smiled, like this was already over. Ready as well. Your Honor? Evelyn began her opening remarks. Her voice was steady. Deliberate. Each word landing like a hammer. She outlined the pattern of manipulation. The altered prescriptions. The bribes disguised as research funding. Then she paused. Turned slightly. And gestured toward me. My client trusted his wife with his health. Instead, she exploited that trust for control and personal gain. We intend to prove that Mrs. Moore's actions were not only unethical but criminal. The defense went next. Rebecca's lawyer leaned on the podium with practiced ease. He said words like delusion, grudge, mental instability. He painted me as an obsessive ex-husband chasing ghosts, unable to move on. When he finished, Rebecca finally looked at me, her eyes cool and faintly amused. The first witness was Dr. Graham. I wasn't sure he would show, but when the bailiff opened the side door, he walked in. His shoulders slumped, his face pale. He avoided my eyes as he took the stand. Evelyn's questions were careful at first, walking him through his history, his connection to the clinic, the prescription process. Then she showed him the document, linking him to Westlake Partners LLC. He hesitated, his jaw tightening. Dr. Graham, did you receive compensation from a company owned by Mrs. Moore during the time you treated Mr. Moore? He looked down. Yes. Was that payment disclosed to the clinic or to my client? No. Did Mrs. Moore ever ask you to alter or manage Mr. Moore's prescription? He hesitated again. The judge leaned forward slightly. Dr. Graham, please answer the question. Yes. He whispered. The courtroom went quiet. Even Rebecca shifted slightly, her fingers gripping the edge of the table. Evelyn pressed on. And did you comply? I did. He said softly. I thought it was harmless. Evelyn let the silence hang for a moment, then nodded. No further questions. The defense attorney stood, smoothing his jacket. Dr. Graham, you've admitted to taking money, to falsifying records, to professional misconduct. Why should anyone believe you now? Dr. Graham's voice cracked. Because it's the truth. I can't live with it anymore. When he stepped down, Evelyn placed her hand lightly on my shoulder. The room buzzed with whispers. Next came the pharmacy technician, Linda Perez. She confirmed that Rebecca had picked up the medication multiple times, that the logs had been altered, and that she'd been instructed to verify Rebecca's signature instead of mine. Her voice trembled, but her words were clear. By the time she finished, the defense looked nervous. Rebecca sat perfectly still, her expression unreadable. Then it was my turn. Taking the stand felt like stepping into open fire. Evelyn guided me gently, asking about the timeline, the symptoms, the trust. I told the truth. How Rebecca managed my medication, how she convinced me I was cursed, infertile, broken, how she humiliated me in public, used pity as a weapon. I could feel eyes on me from every direction, cameras flashing faintly through the glass panels at the back of the room. When Evelyn asked what I wanted from this, I said quietly, I just want the truth on record. For once, I want her to be the one who has to answer for it. The defense attorney's cross-examination was brutal. He asked about my drinking, my job loss, my supposed mental health issues. He implied I was bitter, jealous, unstable. Each question felt like a jab. But I didn't flinch. I had spent years letting Rebecca's version of me exist. This time, I wasn't letting her win. When the day ended, the judge called a recess. Reporters swarmed the hallway. Evelyn pushed through the crowd, keeping her hand on my shoulder. Don't answer them, she whispered. Not yet. Outside, the sky was gray again, a storm brewing. Just like the first night I'd found out. I lit a cigarette I didn't need and stood under the awning, watching the rain start to fall. Evelyn stood beside me, arms crossed. You did good today, she said quietly. She looked at me for a moment, then added, Rebecca's not backing down. I heard she's bringing new evidence tomorrow, something she claims proves you were unstable during the marriage. I laughed, shaking my head. That sounds like her. The next morning, the courtroom was packed. Rebecca wore white this time, innocent, clean, calculated. Her lawyer presented a USB drive and requested permission to play a recording. The judge agreed. The audio played over the speakers. It was me, or at least it sounded like me, shouting, cursing, threatening. The quality was poor, but the intent was clear. Rebecca's voice trembled on the recording. Please, Jack. Stop. You're scaring me. The murmurs spread instantly. I turned to Evelyn. That's not real, she whispered back. It's doctored. I'll prove it. Evelyn requested the metadata. The judge agreed to a recess while the audio was examined. During the break, Rebecca caught my eye again. She smiled, small and cold. Evelyn's assistant came rushing in minutes later, laptop in hand. The file's timestamp doesn't match, she said. It was created after the divorce. Evelyn's lips curved into a thin smile. Perfect. When we reconvened, she stood and explained everything. The metadata, the mismatched encoding, the proof of fabrication. She ended with a quiet statement that cut through the courtroom like a blade. Mrs. Moore didn't just manipulate her husband's health. She continues to manipulate reality itself. The judge's expression hardened. The defense lawyer looked pale. Rebecca's smile faltered for the first time. The proceedings stretched into late afternoon. The judge ordered a full investigation into the recording and granted Evelyn's motion to expand the charges. It was a small victory, but it felt monumental. When we finally left the courthouse, the air smelled like wet pavement and relief. Evelyn exhaled slowly. We're getting close. I nodded. Exhausted but clear-headed. She's slipping. I said. Yeah. Evelyn replied. But don't celebrate yet. Cornered animals fight hardest when they're trapped. That night, I sat on my porch. The city lights flickering in the distance. The rain had stopped, leaving the air heavy and still. I thought about everything that had happened. Every lie. Every scar. The woman who'd once shared my bed was now my enemy. And for the first time, she was losing control. But Evelyn was right. Rebecca wasn't done. And deep down, I knew the next move she made would be the one that changed everything. The next morning started too quiet. The kind of silence that feels staged. I sat by the window with my coffee, staring at the street below. The storm had passed. But something in the air still felt wrong. I had barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Rebecca sitting there in her white suit, smiling like she was untouchable. Evelyn was supposed to call with updates from the DA's office. But my phone stayed silent. By noon, I couldn't take the waiting. I grabbed my keys and headed to her office. When I walked in, her assistant looked up, startled. Evelyn's with the DA right now, she said. They're reviewing new evidence from Rebecca's team. She told me to tell you to stay calm. Calm wasn't happening. I sat in the lobby for almost an hour before Evelyn came out. Her expression, unreadable. She motioned for me to follow her into her office and close the door behind us. She dropped a thick folder onto her desk. Rebecca's team submitted something new. She said, surveillance photos, private messages, bank records, all designed to paint you as unstable and vindictive. I rubbed my face, the frustration building in my chest. Let me guess. Half of it's fake. At least half. She said. But one thing caught my eye. A payment from a company in her name. Made to a private investigator 2 months ago. Looks like she's been tracking you for a while. That made sense. The pictures. The texts. The feeling of being watched. But one part of it stuck in my head. 2 months ago was before the lawsuit. She had started all of this before I even knew about the pills. Why would she do that? I asked quietly. Evelyn tapped her pen against the desk. Maybe she knew something was coming. Maybe someone tipped her off. That thought lingered longer than it should have. Someone had warned her. Someone close enough to know what I was planning. That evening, I sat in my apartment going over everything again. The folder. The payments. The recordings. Then I noticed something strange. One of the files Evelyn had sent me a week earlier had a timestamp that didn't match the rest. It had been modified after I received it. I opened the file. It was a copy of the pharmacy logs. My stomach dropped when I saw it. The name Rebecca Moore had been replaced with authorized pickup by spouse. Someone had changed it. I called Evelyn immediately. She answered on the first ring. Her voice low. Jack. I'm in a meeting. What's wrong? Someone accessed the files. I said. The pharmacy log. It's been altered. There was a pause. Are you sure? Positive. Check your system. She went silent for a few seconds. Then said, I'll handle it. Don't talk to anyone else about this. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone already knew everything I was saying. The next day, Evelyn called again. Her voice tight. Someone hacked into the firm's document archive last night. Only your case files were touched. The DA's copies are safe. But mine are corrupted. My heart started pounding. You think it was her? I don't know. But whoever it was knew exactly what to look for. That night, I went for a drive just to clear my head. I ended up near the old bridge outside Houston. The same one where I'd sat years ago, after finding out about the pills. The water below was dark, reflecting the streetlights like broken glass. I parked and leaned against the rail, trying to breathe. A car pulled up behind me, headlights off. I didn't move. The driver door opened, and a man stepped out, mid-40s. Expensive suit, confident stride. He stopped a few feet away and smiled like we were old friends. "Mr. Moore," he said. "I represent Mrs. Moore's legal interests. I think it would be best for everyone if you walked away from this." I stared at him, the wind carrying the smell of rain off the river. "Is that a threat?" He smiled wider. "A suggestion. You've made your point. The public's seen your story. Let it die before it takes you down too." I took a slow step toward him. "Tell Rebecca she doesn't get to write the ending this time." His smile faltered. He got back in his car and drove off without another word. When I got home, my door was unlocked. I froze. The lights were off. But the faint sound of dripping came from the kitchen. I pushed the door open slowly, every muscle tense. The window above the sink was cracked open, the curtain swaying. On the counter was a small envelope. No name. No return address. Inside was a photo. Rebecca and me? From years ago. Our wedding day. She was smiling at me like she meant it. Behind the photo was a single slip of paper with 6 words written in neat handwriting. "You never should have crossed me." I called Evelyn again. She didn't answer. I tried twice more, then finally sent her a text. "Someone broke into my apartment. Call me as soon as you can." I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the dark with the lights off, watching the shadows move across the walls. Every sound outside made me tense, somewhere between fear and exhaustion. A strange calm settled in. She was getting desperate. By morning, I had made up my mind. I drove straight to the DA's office, walked in, unannounced, and handed them everything: the recordings, the flash drive, the copies of the altered files, even the photo from the envelope. I told them I didn't care what it cost. I wanted her held accountable for everything. The investigator, a broad-shouldered man with tired eyes, listened carefully. When I finished, he said, "Mr. Moore, if what you're saying is true, this goes far beyond a personal lawsuit. We'll need to involve federal authorities." "Do it," I said. 2 days later, the investigation went public. News stations ran with it. Headlines splashed across screens and newspapers. Local realtor accused of medical fraud. Ex-husband claims fertility scam. Brightness CEO under federal scrutiny. Rebecca's perfect image cracked overnight. Clients started cutting ties. Her social media went quiet. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel small. I felt steady. But peace didn't last. The following week, Evelyn called again. Her tone was different this time. Cautious. "Jack, they found something in the financial records. Multiple accounts under Rebecca's name, tied to offshore transfers. And one of them lists you as a beneficiary. That doesn't make sense." I said, "It does if she's setting you up," Evelyn said quietly. I felt the blood drain from my face. She was trying to make it look like I was in on it. By the next morning, a new headline appeared. "Husband implicated in fraud scandal." My name, my photo, my address. The phone rang nonstop. Reporters, strangers, even people I thought were friends. Evelyn told me to stay home. Stay off social media. Say nothing. That night, the same car that had followed me before parked across the street again. This time, the man didn't get out. He just sat there, engine running, lights off. I watched from the window until sunrise. Somewhere deep down, I knew this wasn't just about revenge anymore. Rebecca wasn't trying to win. She was trying to erase me. And if she wanted a war, I was ready to finish it. The day they arrested Rebecca, the sky over Houston was blinding blue. The kind of clear that almost feels cruel. I was sitting in Evelyn's office when the call came from the DA. He didn't sound excited, just steady. They had enough. Fraud, falsification of medical documents, witness tampering, and obstruction of justice. I sat there staring at the wall while Evelyn hung up, a long exhale escaping her lips. "It's over," she said quietly. But it didn't feel over. Not yet. They picked her up at her downtown office. The news broke within the hour. Helicopters circling the glass tower where her face had once hung on billboards. Reporters flooded the street. The footage showed her being led out in handcuffs. Head high. No tears. No panic. Even then, she played the part. The perfect woman. Misunderstood. I didn't watch the rest. I turned off the TV and sat there in silence. That night, the city felt different. Lighter. Maybe? For years. Her voice had lived in my head, whispering doubt into every quiet moment. But now, there was only the hum of the fridge and the steady rhythm of my own breathing. The trial took months. She refused to plead guilty. Of course. Her defense team tried every angle. They said the recordings were faked. The witnesses coerced. That I was unstable and vengeful. But Evelyn dismantled every lie. Piece by piece. Dr. Graham testified again. Shaking but resolute. The pharmacy tech confirmed her story. And the investigators found the offshore accounts. The forged prescriptions. Even the bribes she'd paid to keep people quiet. When the verdict finally came, the courtroom was packed. I sat in the front row, hands clasped together, trying to steady my breathing. Rebecca sat across from me. Dressed in gray this time. No white. No pretense of innocence. She looked smaller than I remembered. But her eyes were the same. Sharp. Unyielding. The judge's voice was calm when he read the sentence. 15 years in federal prison. No parole for at least 10. For a long moment, no one moved. Rebecca didn't look at me. She just stared straight ahead, her expression unreadable. Then, as the bailiff led her away, she turned slightly, her gaze catching mine. There was no hatred there, no fear, just something cold and empty. The kind of look that said she would never believe she lost. When she disappeared through the door, my body finally unclenched. I hadn't realized I'd been holding my breath for years. Evelyn leaned closer and whispered, "It's done, Jack." But I wasn't sure it ever would be. The following weeks felt strange. Reporters still called. TV stations wanted interviews. Podcasts wanted me to talk about the story. I said no to all of it. I wasn't interested in being a headline. I just wanted quiet. I left Houston not long after. Moved to a small town on the Texas coast. Bought a rundown house that smelled like salt and cedar. I fixed it up myself. Piece by piece. Painting. Replacing floorboards. Rebuilding what was broken. It was the first time in a long time I felt like I was building something that belonged only to me. Sometimes I drove into town and grabbed coffee at a small diner by the marina. The waitress there, Sarah, had an easy laugh and a kind smile. She never asked about my past. Though I could tell she'd heard whispers. People always do. But she never pried. One evening, as the sun set over the water, she asked if I was happy here. I thought about it for a while before answering. I don't know if happy's the word, but I'm not afraid anymore. That counts for something. She smiled, nodding like she understood. I started writing again, mostly for myself. At first, it was notes. Then, memories. Then full chapters of everything that had happened. From the day I met Rebecca to the day she was sentenced. Evelyn read the first draft and told me it wasn't just a story about revenge. It was about survival. About what happens when you stop letting someone else define your worth. I didn't plan to publish it, but she convinced me. The book came out under the title, Beneath the Silence. It didn't make me rich or famous, but it found people. Men who'd been humiliated, gaslit, broken. Women who'd escaped manipulation of their own. They wrote to me, dozens of them, saying thank you for telling a story no one else would believe could happen to a man. Years passed quietly after that. I rebuilt my career slowly. Working with a small financial firm that didn't care about my past. My mother visited often, bringing homemade pie and too much advice. Evelyn remained one of my closest friends, though she always reminded me to keep my guard up. Sometimes I still dream about Rebecca, not the good years, but the nights when she'd smile while cutting me down. Her voice like honey hiding poison. I used to wake up angry, my heart racing. Now, I just wake up. I look out at the ocean, listen to the waves, and let it go. On the anniversary of the verdict, I visited the courthouse in Houston. I didn't go inside. I just stood across the street, watching people come and go. No one recognized me anymore. The headlines had faded. The world had moved on. I walked to a nearby park afterward, sat on a bench, and watched families passing by. Kids running, parents laughing, life moving forward. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like an outsider. When the sun dipped low, I took a deep breath and whispered quietly to the wind, "That's enough." The next morning, I opened my small cafe near the pier. I'd bought the space a year earlier, turning it into something simple, warm, and peaceful. Locals came by for coffee. Travelers stopped for a story. I hung a small wooden sign above the counter. It read, "Truth always finds its way home." Sometimes people ask what it means. I just smile and tell them it's something I learned the hard way. One afternoon, a woman came in, maybe in her 50s, wearing a faded blue jacket. She ordered a latte, then looked at me for a long time before saying, "You're Jack Moore, right? The man from that case." I nodded slowly. "Yeah, that was me." She smiled softly. "My brother went through something like that. He never got justice. But your story gave him hope again." I didn't know what to say. I just nodded and said, "Thank you." After she left, I sat by the window, watching the sun hit the waves. The water shimmered gold, endless and calm. For years, I'd thought justice was about punishment, but standing there, surrounded by peace I'd built myself, I realized it was something else. It was the ability to breathe again, to live without the weight of someone else's lies. As the cafe filled with the smell of roasted coffee and laughter, I felt something close to peace. Real peace. The kind that doesn't vanish when the world goes quiet. And if anyone ever asks what happened to Rebecca Moore, I just tell them the truth. She built her empire on deceit. I tore it down with truth. And in the end, truth always wins. If you've been through something like that, if someone's ever made you doubt your own worth or your sanity, remember this. The truth might take time, but it never stays buried forever. It's patient, it's relentless, and one day, it will find its way back to you. So stay strong, stay honest, and when the storm finally passes, you'll realize it wasn't there to break you. It was there to reveal who you really are.